The morning I walked into my supervisor's office and found the woman from the diner sitting across from my director's desk, I thought I had stepped into the wrong meeting. She was wearing a blazer I didn't recognize, a visitor's badge clipped to her lapel, and an expression so calm it made the air in the room feel different. She looked at me the same way she had looked at me 3 weeks earlier, like she already knew exactly who I was. My director cleared his throat and said, "Rachel, I think you two have already met." I didn't answer right away. I just stood there in the doorway of that conference room, holding my notebook against my chest, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Her name, as it turned out, was Dr. Tu, Margaret Okafor, and she was not just a tired woman whose card had declined at a diner outside of Columbus, Ohio on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She was the newly appointed Regional Director of Patient Services for the entire hospital network, the person who had just been handed oversight of 14 facilities, including the one where I worked. The person who, in about 48 hours, would be deciding which department managers kept their jobs and which ones didn't. But I didn't know any of that when I sat down across from her at Patty's Diner and slid her check to my side of the table. I had been a floor nurse at Mercy General for 6 years by the time any of this happened. I had started in pediatrics, moved to the cardiac step-down unit after my 3rd year, and somewhere along the way I had become the kind of nurse that new staff got quietly directed toward when they needed to know how things actually worked. Not officially. Not on any org chart. But if you needed to know which attending liked to be paged directly and which one preferred you go through the resident, or how to handle a family that was starting to escalate, or where the good parking was on a Tuesday, you came to me. I liked my job. I want to say that clearly because what comes next might make it sound like I didn't. I liked the work itself, the part where you walk into a room and a person is scared and in pain, and you can actually do something about that. I liked my team, most of them anyway. What I did not like was my nurse manager. His name was Director Halbrook, and he had been running our unit for about 18 months by the time I'm describing. He had come from administration, never worked a floor shift in his professional life as far as anyone could tell, and he had the particular confidence of someone who had never once been wrong about anything, mostly because he had arranged his environment so that no one was ever in a position to tell him he was. He wasn't cruel in an obvious way. It was subtler than that. It was the way he would call a meeting to discuss communication concerns, and then spend 45 minutes describing in careful detail an incident that everyone in the room knew had involved you without ever saying your name. It was the way he would volunteer you for the worst holiday shifts and then send a department-wide email thanking you for your team spirit. It was the way he smiled when he delivered bad news, like the smile was proof that the news wasn't really that bad, and if you felt bad about it, that said something about you. I had been on his list since about my 4th month under him, when I had flagged a medication order I thought was wrong and turned out to be right. He had never forgiven me for it in the particular way that small people never forgive you for being correct at their expense. He didn't do anything dramatic, he just made things consistently, quietly harder. A pattern of paper cuts that never showed up on any formal record but that I felt every single day I walked into that unit. I had been trying to get a transfer to the sister hospital across town for almost a year. It kept not going through. I had a strong suspicion I knew why. The Tuesday it all changed, I was not even supposed to be at Patty's Diner. I had a standing habit of eating lunch at my desk. Cheaper, faster, fewer decisions. But that day a pipe had burst somewhere in the hospital's east wing, and the whole building smelled like wet concrete and something I couldn't identify but that made my throat feel tight. I had an hour. I got in my car and drove. Patty's was about 8 minutes from the hospital on a good traffic day. It had been there since the 1970s and looked like it in the best possible way. The kind of place with laminated menus and coffee that came in a pot left on your table and a pie case by the register that was always 2/3 empty by noon. I had been going there maybe once a month for years. The woman who usually worked the lunch counter knew my order. I got there a little after 12:30. The place was about half full. I took a booth near the window and ordered the turkey melt and a coffee and sat there for a few minutes just breathing air that smelled like bacon and dish soap instead of whatever was happening at the hospital. That's when I noticed the woman at the counter. She was somewhere in her early 60s, I guessed. Natural silver hair, cut short and neat. She was wearing a dark green cardigan over a white collared shirt, and there was something about the way she sat, very straight, very still, that made her look like a person who was used to being in control of whatever room she was in. She had a small leather notebook open next to her coffee cup, and she was writing something in it in the precise, unhurried way of someone who writes by hand every day. I wasn't paying much attention to her until I heard the cashier's voice change. "I'm sorry, ma'am, it's coming up declined again." The woman at the counter set down her pen. "That's not possible. Can you run it once more? I've run it 3 times. I'm really sorry." There was a pause. I watched the woman open her wallet and look through it with the careful attention of someone doing an inventory. She checked a second card, then a third. She set her wallet down on the counter, and for just a second, barely a second, something crossed her face. Not embarrassment exactly. More like the controlled expression of someone choosing not to show the thing they're actually feeling. She was composed in a way that somehow made the situation more uncomfortable to watch, not less. The total on the ticket was $11.40. I don't know why I did what I did next without thinking about it harder. I've been asked that question a few times since, and the honest answer is that it wasn't a decision so much as a reflex. I had been that person before, not in a diner, but in other ways, in other rooms. And I knew what it felt like to be very capable and suddenly, publicly unable, and to have people watching you manage it. I picked up my purse, walked to the register, and handed the cashier a 20. "I've got hers," I said quietly. The cashier looked at me. The woman at the counter looked at me. "Please," I said, in a way that I hoped made it clear I wasn't looking for a conversation about it. I went back to my booth. I ate my turkey melt. I left before she had finished her coffee, because I didn't want her to feel obligated to say anything to me. I didn't know her name. I didn't ask. I left a tip and walked out into the parking lot and drove back to the hospital and didn't think about it much for the rest of the afternoon. 3 weeks later, Director Halbert called me into his office. He did this thing when he wanted you to know the meeting was serious. He kept you standing for a moment before he gestured to the chair, long enough to be deliberate, but not long enough that you could call it rude. I had sat through enough of these meetings to recognize all the small signals, the folder on his desk, the way he positioned himself slightly sideways rather than facing you directly. "We're doing departmental reviews this quarter," he said, "as part of the new network initiative." I nodded. "There's been some feedback," he said, "about your interactions with certain families, about your communication style being," he paused, choosing the word carefully, "abrasive." I looked at him steadily. "I'd like to see that feedback in writing." He smiled. "That's the kind of response that concerns people, Rachel. I think asking to see written documentation of complaints about my performance is a reasonable professional request." He leaned back in his chair. "The review process involves input from multiple stakeholders. The regional director's office has been conducting site visits as part of the transition. I want to make sure your file reflects where you actually stand." I understood what he was doing. He was telling me, in the careful language people like him used, that something was being built. A paper trail. Slowly, methodically, in the way that had been used against me before and would be used against me again if I let it. "I understand," I said. "Good." He opened the folder. "I want you to put together a written reflection on your last 6 months. Key interactions, any challenges, how you've been addressing them. Have it to me by Friday. A written reflection, addressed to him, to be added to my file." I recognized the mechanism. It was not a reflection. It was a document that, depending on what I wrote and how he framed it, could be used to support whatever he had already decided to do. I left his office and went directly to the bathroom at the end of the hall and stood at the sink for about 2 minutes. I wasn't afraid. I want to be precise about that. I was tired in a way that went deeper than any amount of sleep could fix, and I was angry in the controlled, slow-burning way that comes from a very long time of being very patient. I had been doing this for 6 years. I was a good nurse. I knew I was a good nurse. And I was about to be managed out of a job by a person who had never once sat with a patient at 2 a.m. and held their hand while they waited for the pain medication to kick in. I went back to the unit. I did my job. I went home. I wrote the reflection. I was careful with every word. I was professional and honest, and I said nothing that could be twisted, and I submitted it on Thursday instead of Friday because I wanted him to know I wasn't rattled. The following Monday, my charge nurse knocked on the break room door and told me the director needed me in the main conference room. "Meeting's already started," she said. Her voice was careful. "Who's in there?" She hesitated. "Director Halbrook. Someone from the regional office, I think, and Dr. Kessler." Dr. Kessler was the chief of medicine. He almost never came to floor-level meetings. I closed my locker. I followed her down the hall. I pushed open the conference room door. Director Halbrook was sitting at the head of the table. Dr. Kessler was to his left. And across from them, sitting very straight in her chair, with a leather notebook open in front of her, was the woman from the diner. She looked at me when I walked in. Her expression didn't change. I stood in the doorway for a moment longer than I should have. "Rachel," Director Halbrook said, "this is Dr. Okafor. She's been appointed Regional Director of Patient Services. She's doing a review of our unit as part of the network transition." Dr. Okafor nodded at me. "Please sit down." I sat. She asked me questions for about 20 minutes. Not the kind of questions I had expected, not about the written reflection, not about the communication concerns. She asked me about patient outcomes, about how I handled escalations, about what I thought was working on the unit and what I thought wasn't. She asked in the direct, unhurried way of someone who had been listening to people answer questions for a long time and could tell immediately when an answer was honest and when it wasn't. I answered honestly. I didn't look at Director Halbrook while I did it. I kept my eyes on her and I said what I actually thought. At one point she asked, "What would you change about how this unit is managed if you could change one thing?" There was a silence. Director Halbrook shifted in his chair. I said, "I'd want decisions about staff to be based on documented patient outcomes and peer review, rather than on informal feedback that isn't attributed to anyone." Another silence. Dr. Okafor wrote something in her notebook. Then she looked up and said, "Thank you, Rachel. That's all for now." I stood to leave. "One more thing," she said. I turned. "Patty's Diner, about 3 weeks ago, Tuesday afternoon, you were eating lunch." The room was very quiet. "I owe you $11.40, she said. I looked at her. "You don't, actually." Something shifted in her expression, the closest thing to a smile I had seen from her in that room. "Then I owe you a thank you." "You don't owe me that either," I said. "I just didn't want you to have a bad lunch." She looked at me for a moment. Then she wrote something else in her notebook and closed it. "I'll be in touch," she said, not to the room, to me. I found out most of what happened next from my charge nurse, who found out from someone in HR, in the way that information moves through hospitals, officially, slowly, unofficially, at the speed of light. Director Halbrook's review had not gone well, not because of anything I had said, or anything anyone on the floor had reported to Dr. Okafor directly. She had been doing site visits at all 14 facilities in the network. She had spent 3 days at ours. She had spoken to patients, to families, to nursing staff, to residents, to housekeeping. She had read files. She had sat in on handoff meetings without announcing herself. She was, by all accounts, extraordinarily thorough. The written reflection process he had implemented, the one designed to build documentation on staff he wanted gone, turned out to be something he had started doing in the months before the regional review. 3 nurses before me, all of them women, all of them with strong performance records and no formal complaints. All of them had quietly resigned or requested transfers rather than fight it, because that is what happens when you are 6 years into a job you love and someone with institutional power decides to make your life quietly impossible. You leave. Because leaving costs less than staying and fighting something that isn't visible enough to point at. Dr. Okafor pointed at it. I was not in the room when the conversation happened, but I was told that it was not a long conversation and that Director Halbrook was very pale when he left it. and that by the end of the week he had taken a leave of absence that became, about a month later, a resignation. Dr. Kazan, Okafor called me into her temporary office. They had set her up in the administrative wing during the review period on a Wednesday afternoon about 2 weeks after the conference room meeting. She was standing at the window when I came in, looking out at the parking lot, and she gestured to the chairs without turning around. I sat. She turned. She still had the leather notebook. I wondered if she ever put it down. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer it honestly." Okay. In a different version of that conference room meeting, one where you didn't already know I was the woman from the diner, would you have answered my questions the same way? I thought about it. Yes. She studied me. Why? Because I'd already decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to keep adjusting my honest professional assessment of things based on who was in the room. That costs too much. I paused. It took me longer to learn that than it should have. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You left the diner before I could thank you." I know. Why? Because I didn't do it so you'd thank me. I did it because your card declined and your lunch was getting cold. She looked at me for a long moment. "I want to offer you the clinical lead coordinator position for this unit," she said. "It's a new role. Part of the restructuring. You'd be responsible for peer review processes, outcome tracking, and staff development. It would be a formal role, not an informal one." I opened my mouth. "Before you say anything," she said, "I want you to know that the offer has nothing to do with what happened at Patty's Diner. I've reviewed your record. I've spoken with colleagues, patients, and attending physicians. The offer is based entirely on what's in that record." She tilted her head slightly. "The Patty's Diner situation did not hurt you. But it is not why I'm offering you this position." I closed my mouth. Then I said, "I know." She raised an eyebrow. "Because you don't seem like the kind of person who would let it," I said. Something crossed her face then. Not quite a smile, but something in the neighborhood of one. She picked up her notebook. "Think about it," she said. "Take a few days." I took 2. I said yes. The transition took about 6 weeks. The unit was different in the months after the review, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the small, accumulating ways that matter more than dramatic gestures. There was a new manager, an internal hire, someone who had been a charge nurse for 9 years and ran the handoff meetings the way good handoff meetings should be run. The 3 nurses who had been edged out before me were contacted. 2 of them came back. I thought about the diner sometimes. I thought about the specificity of that moment. The declined card, the way she had controlled her expression, the $11.40. I had not known who she was. There was no way to know, and if I had known, it would have been the wrong reason to do what I did, and she would have known it was the wrong reason, and none of what followed would have meant what it meant. I thought about what she had said in that office, that the offer was based entirely on the record, that the diner had not hurt me, but was not why she was offering the job. I believed her. I believed her because I had watched her work for 6 weeks by then, and I understood by that point that she was constitutionally incapable of sentiment in her professional decisions. She had seen something in my file and in the way I answered questions and in the specific words I had chosen in that conference room. That was what she had acted on. The diner had only told her that I was the same in private as I was in that conference room, that when no one important was watching, I behaved in accordance with what I said I believed. She had filed that away and used it as confirmation of something she had already decided independently. I don't think that's a small thing. I had lunch at Patty's a few months later. I took one of the newer nurses on my team, a young woman named Danny who was 3 months out of school and still in that phase where everything about the job felt either overwhelming or astonishing, and sometimes both at once. She reminded me of myself, a little, from a long time ago. We sat in a booth near the window. I ordered the turkey melt out of habit. Danny ordered the grilled cheese and ate it with the focused appreciation of someone who had started a shift at 5:30 and was eating her first meal at 12:45. At some point she asked me how long I'd been a nurse. I told her 6 years. She asked if I'd always worked at Mercy General, and I said yes. She asked what the hardest part of the job was, and I thought about it for a moment. Learning to stay the same person regardless of who's watching, I said. That sounds simple. It isn't. She considered that, pulling apart the crust of her grilled cheese. Do you ever get used to it? She asked. You get better at it, I said. That's different from used to it. She nodded like she understood, and I thought she probably did, or at least would. She had the particular attentiveness of a person who was going to figure things out, given enough time and enough bad lunches and enough quiet moments where no one important was watching, and you still did the right thing anyway. The coffee came in a pot, the way it always did. I refilled my cup. Outside the window, the parking lot was gray and damp and ordinary, exactly the way it had been on the Tuesday afternoon I had walked into this same diner and made a small decision that I already would have forgotten, if it hadn't turned out to matter. But the decision itself that had already been made, long before she walked in, long before the card declined, long before any of it. That part had nothing to do with her.